Good day, everyone. I am Elrose Lucas and I am tasked to explain the alignment between our learning objectives, our activities, and our assessment. Our lesson plan consists of different specific lesson procedures that we need to perform in order to attain the learning objectives or the learning competencies within the span of 5 days. Let me start with day 1. For day 1, we formulate 3 learning objectives. First is to identify direct and indirect speech. Next is to recognize the differences between direct and indirect speech. And lastly, to create sentences using direct and indirect speech. For the first learning objective, which is to identify direct or indirect speech, it will be attained or achieved during the assessment in the form of a 5-item quiz. It is where the students will be given 5 sentences or statements that they need to identify whether the statement is direct or indirect speech. Now, for the second learning objective, which is to recognize the differences between direct or indirect speech, it will be attained after the discussion of the lesson or the abstraction, in which the teacher will discuss the differences between direct and indirect speech. For the last learning objective, which is to create sentences using direct or indirect speech, it will be attained after the application. It is where the teacher will group the students into 5, and the students is tasked to create a conversational dialogue with 2 or more members of the group using direct and indirect speech. For the second day, we've also formulated 3 learning objectives. The first objective is to identify the rules in converting direct speech into indirect speech. Next, convert direct speech into indirect speech. And lastly, retell a direct speech into indirect speech. The first learning objective, which is to identify the rules in converting direct speech into indirect speech, will be achieved during or after the discussion, wherein the teacher will identify the different rules that a person should use in converting direct speech into indirect speech. The second learning objective, which is to convert direct speech into indirect speech, will be attained during the assessment. It is where the students will be given 10 sentences that they need to convert into indirect speech or direct speech. For the last learning objective, which is to retell a direct speech into indirect speech, it will be attained or achieved in the application section of the LP. It is where the students will listen to a campaign speech and will jot down the important details of the speech and retell it to the class in the form of indirect speech. Now, let's proceed to day 3. For day 3, we also formulated 3 learning objectives. First is to recognize the rules in converting indirect speech to direct speech. Next is to convert indirect speech to direct speech. And lastly, to form a statement using direct speech. For the first learning objective, which is to recognize the rules in converting indirect speech to direct speech, it will be attained during the discussion of the lesson or the abstraction. It is where the teacher will discuss the different rules for conversion of indirect speech to direct speech. For the second learning objective, which is to convert indirect speech into direct speech, it will be achieved or attained during the assessment in a form of quiz. It is where the students will convert or change the 5 sentences given into direct speech. For the third learning objective, which is to form a statement using direct speech, it will be attained in the activity wherein the student will transform a statement from an indirect speech into a direct speech. Now for day 4. For day 4, we created 4 learning objectives. The first one is to recall direct and indirect speech. Next is to identify if the statement is indirect speech or direct speech and convert it. Another, recognize common situations where the use of direct and indirect speech is evident. And lastly, demonstrate effective use of direct and indirect speech by creating a script for a skit or mini drama using direct or indirect speech in real life situations. For the second learning objective, which is to identify if a statement is direct or indirect speech and convert it, it will be achieved during the assessment, wherein the students will be given different statements that they need to identify if it is a direct speech or indirect speech. And if it is direct speech, they need to convert it into indirect speech and vice versa. For the third learning objective, which is to recognize common situations where the use of direct and indirect speech is evident, will be achieved during the abstraction or the discussion, where the students will be encouraged to share different life experiences or scenarios in which the use of indirect speech and direct speech is evident. For the last learning objective, which is to demonstrate effective use of direct and indirect speech by creating a script for a skit or mini drama using direct or indirect speech in various real-life situations, it will be achieved in the application where the students will perform or make a script about a certain real-life situation using direct and indirect speech.